Welcome to another episode of Throwing It Back with Sean Farrell. I am Sean Farrell. God is great all the time. All the time, God is great. Now let's get into it. So, I was listening to this on Sports Talk Radio this week. And it was being talked about how Dynasties come to it unceremoniously end, okay? One example I could take is the 80s Lakers. 5 titles in the 1980s, about 9 title appearances, 9 championship finals appearances in all, with the exception of 1981 and 1986. They were in every finals in the West in the 80s. Then the 1990 season came about, and the Lakers still pretty much had the same core from the 80s, but it was just a different feel without Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. They did go 63-19 that year. Then they proceeded to get kicked out of the second round by the Phoenix Suns that year. Riley was named Coach of the Year. Magic Johnson was MVP that year. But there was infighting between the Laker players, Lakers co-coaching staff. There was infighting going on. And I remember reading in a book, Roland Lazenby, if I said his name right, was talking about the 1990 Lakers. He said the locomotive never slowed down in terms of the Showtime fast break. The locomotive never slowed down. He said, but the engine was making funny noises. Okay. So they still had Byron. They still had AC. They still had Magic. Still had Worthy. Still had Michael Thompson. They did have Vlade Divac that year. They had 6-man Orlando Woolridge. So yeah, the core was still pretty much there, but the engine was making funny noises, and the Lakers staffer, one Lakers staffer described as a 1990 season being very, very ugly, despite going 63-19, okay? And so Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's retirement had a effect on the head of a team. There were some people who there were some players on the team, most notably Michael Cooper, or players on the team who thought that Magic was starting to turn into Pat Riley. And you know how Pat Riley coached the Knicks? That was his real personality when he coached the Knicks. I think that personality was beginning to be shown by the start of 1989. Okay. His true personality was beginning to show by 1989 and into 1990. And by the time he got to the Knicks after the 1991 season, that was his true personality. A fighter, scrapper, yeller, tough, hard-nosed, blue collar. That was Pat Riley. But like I said, dynasties come to unceremoniously end. The Lakers dynasty pretty much ended in 1990. There was a lot of infighting going on. They did make the finals in 1991. Okay. So they were still a pretty excellent team. But there was a decline in 1992, further decline in 93. You know, missing the playoffs in 1994. And then returned to the playoffs in 95. Then rest is history. You know. But when the Chicago Bulls broke up in 1998. For about the next 6 years, they were one of the worst team. They were the worst team in the league, bar none. The Chicago Bulls after 1998 were one of the worst teams in the league by far. The Boston Celtics of the 80s, who made several finals appearances, won three titles. They drafted Len Bias, and then Len Bias tragically died. And I think that forced Bird, McHale, and Parrish to play beyond their years. And there was a decline after the 1988 season. 89, they went 42-40. They went 52-30 in 1990, 56-26 in 91, 51-31 in 92, 48-34 in 93. Then the bottom fell out in 1994. I can only help what would happen if they had drafted Len Bias that year. And you got to remember, he also drafted Reggie Lewis in 1987. So I couldn't help but wonder, what would that team be like? Because Larry Bird said he would have retired if Len Bias was actually playing after the 88 or 89 season. Larry Bird was actually going to retire. Okay, so I couldn't help but wonder the core of Len Bias, Reggie Lewis, Robert Parrish, Kevin McHale. Man, just thinking about that for a second. Now, Robert Parrish was in pretty good. Robert Parrish was in excellent shape. Okay, Robert Parrish kept himself in shape. Okay, he played until he was like 42, 43. And actually won the title with the Bulls his final year in the league. So Robert Parrish could have kept on home play hanging. So, but yeah, who else? I mentioned the Bulls. I mentioned the 80s Lakers, 80s Celtics. Yeah, I would say I don't think the early 2000 Lakers count. Well, I think they kind of do. They won 3 straight. Then that 2002-2003 season, they really struggled. I believe they got off to like a 5-11 start. The Lakers were 5-11 through about the first 15-16 games of that year. 5-11. And so, yeah, they ended up going 50-32 that year. But the Spurs came back. But the Spurs kicked them out of the second round, made the finals in 2004. Lost to the Pistons, which they should not have done. Still baffled by that. And then they were irrelevant for a few years until they got Powell, Gasol, and then of course they came back to be champions, back-to-back champions, 09, 010. So dynasties end. Dynasties generally don't end well. Just ask the Bulls, the Lakers, the Celtics, and the Golden State Warriors, who are not a good team. They are really struggling. Okay, so there you go. I'm watching a special on Bill Walton, the luckiest guy in the world. And they were talking about Artis Gilmore and the Bulls playing the Blazers in round one of the 77 playoffs. Um, Artis Gilmore was pretty good that year. Um, and he had a pretty good career. And he had a pretty good career as an NBA player. But he first started out in the ABA. And so had a pretty good ABA career. Was picked up by he was actually drafted by the Bulls in 1970, I believe. The year he came to the ABA. So he was drafted by the Chicago Bulls of the NBA. He was drafted by the Kentucky Colonels, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, of the ABA. But he played in the ABA first. Then when the ABA disbanded and merged with the NBA in 1976, the Bulls got him again in the ABA dispersal draft, okay? And he was considered the most dominant Chicago Bull before, of course, you know who got to town, okay? We don't need to we already know who he is, okay? So he was considered the most dominant Chicago Bull before you know who got to town in 1984, okay? But he had some excellent years with Chicago. Played with and you also got to remember he also played with Reggie Theus as well. And the Bulls also had a guy by the name of David Greenwood. He was pretty good. And so he had some excellent years in Chicago. But one of the things about the Bulls that Gilmore didn't like was their inability to build a team, to build a team to compete and win every year. So Gilmore wanted out, got traded to San Antonio for Dave Corzine, if I'm not mistaken. Got traded for Dave Corzine. Yeah, so and he went to the Western Conference Finals his first year with San Antonio. Lost to the Lakers in the Western Conference Finals, 83. And had some very solid years with the Spurs from 1984 through 1987. Then signed with the Bulls. He was actually traded to the Bulls for the 87-88 season, okay? And it's ironic that he was pushed out a few years earlier before MJ got there. Now he's playing with MJ. So Artis Gilmore played with Pippen. He played with Jordan. And Phil Jackson, who was an assistant coach at that time with the Bulls under Doug Collins. Yeah, so Gilmore played with Jordan and Pippen. Horace Grant. Horace Grant was on that team. So he was the starting center at the beginning of the year, but he asked for his release midway through the year. So the Bulls gave him his release, signed with the Celtics, and went to the conference finals again with the Celtics, but lost to Detroit in 6 games. And played basketball overseas for a few years, and that was pretty much the end of his career. Speaking of Detroit, it's just popped into my mind. The Detroit Dynasty, the Pistons' 2-year dynasty, didn't end in a good way, because Detroit was pretty because Detroit was pretty much old by the time the 1990-91 season came around. And if you watch that Bad Boys documentary, Kid Rock, who was the narrative, said something felt different going into the 1990-91 season. Okay. And so Pistons went 50-32 that year, got swept by Chicago in the conference finals. Then they really declined each year up until the year Grant Hill got hot there. So, yeah. Dynasties don't end beautifully. So, all right. That's it. And that's all. Thank you for watching Throwing It Back with Sean Farrell. I am out of here. Peace.